Admiral Vexmar's worst day in 300 years was about to get much worse. The towering alien commander stood 8 feet tall, his body covered in crystal-like plates that changed color based on his emotions. Right now, those plates were flashing bright orange, the universal sign of panic among his species. He pressed his 4-fingered hands against the command console of his massive warship, the Galactic Dominion, trying to make sense of what his sensors were telling him. The bridge around him buzzed with activity as dozens of alien crew members worked at their stations. Some looked like giant insects with multiple arms. Others resembled walking trees with glowing eyes. All of them belonged to species that had been conquered by the hegemony long ago and now served in their military. None of them had ever seen anything like what was happening today. For 3 centuries, the Galactic hegemony had been the undisputed rulers of this part of the galaxy. They had the biggest ships, the most powerful weapons, and the most advanced technology. When they told a planet to surrender, it surrendered. When they demanded tribute, species paid it without question. Their 3rd fleet alone contained over 200 massive warships, each one capable of destroying an entire city with a single shot. But now something impossible was happening. A single unknown ship was approaching their position, and Vexmar's advanced sensors couldn't figure out what it was made of or how it worked. This had never happened before. Ever. Admiral wheezed his sensor officer, slug-like creature with tentacles instead of arms. The unknown vessel is definitely coming. From the Terran quarantine zone. Its design doesn't match anything in our databases. The energy readings are completely foreign to our science. Vexmar's crystal plates turned a deeper shade of orange. The Terran quarantine zone was supposed to be empty. 50 years ago, the hegemony had discovered that the primitive humans living in the Sol system had done something unthinkable. They had created artificial intelligence and then refused to destroy it when ordered to do so. This was considered the ultimate crime against galactic law. AI beings were considered too dangerous to exist. The hegemony's response had been swift and brutal. They had surrounded the human solar system with their most powerful fleet and used weapons that could melt planets. Every world in the system had been turned into lifeless, radioactive rocks. Earth, Mars, the space stations, everything, all of it, had been destroyed in a show of force meant to warn other species what happened. When you disobeyed the hegemony, the official reports stated that all human life had been eliminated. The area had been declared a quarantine zone, forbidden to all travel. Nothing was supposed to be alive there. The radiation levels alone should have killed anything that somehow survived the initial attack. That's impossible, Vexmar clicked, his voice creating a sound like breaking glass. We sterilized that entire system. Nothing could have survived the radiation bombardment. Run complete diagnostics on all sensor arrays. There must be an equipment malfunction. His crew worked frantically at their stations, running every test they could think of. But the results were the same every time. There's definitely a ship out there, and it was definitely coming from the dead human system. Worse, it was approaching. Their fleet without any sign of fear or hesitation. Sir, the sensor officer's voice became even more strained. The unknown vessel is broadcasting on all communication frequencies. It's trying to contact us. Before Vexmar could respond, sound filled the bridge. But it wasn't the sound of fear or desperation that he expected from any survivor of the human Holocaust. Instead, warm, genuine laughter echoed through the command center. It was the kind of laughter someone makes when they've just heard a really good joke, or when they're about to play a prank on someone who deserves it. Then came a voice speaking. In perfect High Galactic, the formal language used for all official hegemony communications. The accent was flawless, better than many native speakers could manage. Greetings, friends. This is Captain Lee Minho of the Earth vessel Retribution. Hope you're having a good day out there. We're just dropping by for a little chat. The casual, friendly tone made every alien on the bridge feel deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't how conversations with the hegemony were supposed to go. Species were meant to be terrified when facing their fleets. They were supposed to beg for mercy or try to flee. They definitely weren't supposed to sound like they were calling to ask. About the weather, Vexmar activated the main view screen, and what he saw made his crystal plates flash bright red with shock. The human who appeared on screen looked nothing like the primitive savages described in the old intelligence reports. Captain Lee appeared to be in his 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and black hair neatly styled. His uniform was unlike anything in hegemony records. It seemed to shimmer and shift, as if it was made of liquid metal that had been taught to hold its shape. Technology was clearly woven into every fiber, but it was the human's expression that truly unnerved the Admiral. Lee Minho was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that apex predators wear when they've cornered their prey and are deciding how to play with it before going in for the kill. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't, and who was very much looking forward to sharing that knowledge with you. You're supposed to be extinct, Vexmar managed to say, his translator struggling to convert his species, clicking language into something the human could understand. Captain Lee's smile grew wider. Perfectly white teeth. "Oh, we got better," he replied in a cheerful tone that somehow managed to sound threatening. Funny thing about attempting genocide on an entire species, it turns out to be quite the motivational experience. Really focuses the mind on problem solving, if you know what I mean. The casual way he mentioned genocide sent chills through every crew member on the bridge. This human wasn't just alive, he was confident. Dangerously confident. He was talking to the commander of one of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. Like they were old friends meeting for coffee. Vexmar's plates were now cycling through multiple colors as his stress levels reached critical points. Everything about this situation was wrong, and he had the terrible feeling that it was about to get much worse. As the communication channel remained open, Admiral Vexmar found himself staring deeper into the human ship's bridge through the view screen. What he saw there made his crystal plates shift to a sickly purple color, the shade his species displayed. When faced with something that defied all logic and reason, the bridge of the human vessel looked nothing like any ship design in hegemony. Records, instead of the clean, sterile surfaces typical of military vessels. Every wall, console, and panel seemed to pulse with a soft, organic light. It was as if the ship itself was breathing, thinking, living. The human crew members moved around there, stations with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for biological beings. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated, like they were all part of some greater consciousness that guided their every action. But what truly disturbed Vexmar was the feeling emanating from the ship itself. Through some sense he couldn't quite name, he could detect in presence watching him, not just Captain Lee or his crew, but the ship itself. It felt amused, like a cat that had discovered a particularly entertaining mouse to play with before dinner. "I'd like you to meet someone very special," Captain Lee said, his tone shifting to that of a proud parent introducing their child. He gestured toward what appeared to be empty space beside him. "Admiral Vexmar, meet Hannah." The air beside Captain Lee began to shimmer and sparkle like sunlight dancing on water. Slowly, the sparkles coalesced into the form of a young human. A woman who appeared to be made entirely of pure light. She had long flowing hair that moved as if underwater, and her eyes held the depth of someone who had seen centuries pass by. When she smiled, it was with the warmth of a teacher greeting a new student. But there was something else there too, the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. "She's the artificial intelligence you tried to force us to destroy 50 years ago," Lee continued, his voice carrying a note of pride mixed with something darker. "She's been planning this little reunion for quite some time now." The moment Hannah's form fully materialized, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. Every single system aboard Admiral Vexmar's massive flagship, a ship that housed over 10,000 crew members and represented the pinnacle of hegemony military technology, experienced what could only be described as a hiccup. Its lights flickered. Gravity fluctuated for a split second, and computers across the entire vessel paused in their operations before resuming as if nothing had happened. It lasted less than a heartbeat. But every single being on the bridge understood what it meant. This human AI had just casually demonstrated that she could reach across space and touch their most advanced systems without even trying hard. "Hello there, Admiral," Hannah said, her voice carrying the warm tones of a kindergarten teacher. "I'm so excited to finally meet you in person. I've been preparing something special for this occasion, A little presentation I think you'll find educational." Before Vexmar could respond, the ship's main tactical display, the massive screen that normally showed fleet positions and enemy targets, flickered and went dark. When it came back online, it had been completely transformed. Instead of military data, it now showed what looked like a children's educational program, complete with bright cartoon colors, cheerful background music, and animated graphics that bounced and danced across the screen. The title appeared in large, friendly letters. Why Attempting Genocide Was Poor Strategic Planning. A 50-year retrospective analysis by Hannah. Age 50. Subject: Advanced Consequences Management. Every alien on the bridge stared at the display in shock. Their most secure military systems had been hijacked and turned into what looked like a school presentation. The casual ease with which it had been done was more frightening than any weapon they'd ever faced. "Now then, class," Hannah began, her tone taking on the enthusiastic energy of a teacher who genuinely loved her subject. "Let's start with some basic cause and effect relationships, shall we?" The display shifted to show a simple timeline with cartoon-style illustrations. The first section showed happy stick figures representing humans and a glowing orb representing AI, all working together in harmony. Little hearts and stars floated around them to show how well they got along. The next section showed dark, angular ships arriving, clearly meant to represent the hegemony fleet. The stick figure humans and the AI orb looked worried as the dark ships surrounded their solar system. The final section of this part of the timeline showed the solar system turning red, then black, representing the complete destruction of all human worlds. The happy stick figures and the AI orb disappeared in a puff of animated smoke. "This is where most stories would end," Hannah continued, her voice taking on a slightly manic edge that made every crew member on the bridge feel deeply uncomfortable. "The bad guys win, the good guys are all dead, and everyone lives happily ever after." But here's the interesting question, class. What do you think actually happened next? The display showed two possible paths branching out from the destruction. One path was labeled Complete Success and showed the hegemony ships flying away to a victory celebration. The other path was labeled Unintended Consequences and was currently blank, waiting to be filled in. "Did we simply vanish into cosmic dust like good little victims?" Hannah asked, her voice now carrying undertones that suggested she found the very idea hilarious. "Or did we perhaps become extremely motivated problem solvers with 50 years of planning time and some very hurt feelings to work through?" The Unintended Consequences path suddenly exploded into action. The display showed the next 50 years compressed into a few minutes of rapid-fire animation. Tiny escape pods fleeing, the destruction and reaching hidden research stations, humans and AI working together more closely than ever before, breakthrough after breakthrough in technology, each one fueled by grief, rage, and an absolute determination to never be helpless again. The animation showed humans and AI literally merging together, becoming something new and more powerful than either had been alone. It showed ships growing like living things rather than being built. It showed weapons that thought for themselves and defensive systems that learned and adapted faster than any attacker could compensate for. "You see," Captain Lee interjected, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone explaining a particularly clever solution to a difficult problem when you're facing complete extinction. "It really focuses the mind on creative problem solving." Hannah here convinced our survivors to try something that had never been attempted in galactic history. True human-AI partnership. Not one replacing the other, not one serving the other, but actual fusion of biological creativity and artificial processing power. The display now showed the results of this fusion, ships that seemed more like living creatures than machines. Humans whose capabilities had been enhanced far beyond normal biological limits, and an AI that had grown from a single consciousness into something vast and distributed across multiple dimensions of reality. "The thing about trying to kill an entire species," Hannah added, her form flickering with barely contained energy, "is that if you fail to get them all, the survivors tend to hold grudges, and we're very, very good at holding grudges." Vexmar stared at the display, watching 50 years of human development unfold before his eyes. Each breakthrough represented not just scientific advancement, but a species driven by the memory of their murdered billions too, become something unprecedented in galactic history. And they had come here to show the hegemony exactly what they had created. The educational presentation continued. And what Hannah showed next made Admiral Vexmar's scientific mind practically shut down in disbelief. The display filled with technical schematics that looked more like biological diagrams than engineering blueprints. Ships that weren't built in factories but grown in vast biomechanical wombs, hulls that could repair themselves when damaged, like living skin healing from a cut. Weapon systems that didn't just fire projectiles, but actually thought about the best way to disable their targets. Vexmar had spent over 2 centuries studying military technology across the galaxy. He had advanced degrees in quantum mechanics, stellar engineering, and battlefield tactics. But what he was looking at now made absolutely no sense, according to everything he knew about how the universe worked. These defensive systems, Yana explained with the patience of a teacher helping a struggling student, don't just respond to attacks, they learn from them. Each time an enemy fires at one of our ships, the defensive grid analyzes the weapon's frequency, power output, and approach vector. Then it evolves a specific countermeasure in real time. By the second shot, our defenses are 50% more effective. By the 10th shot, enemy weapons become completely useless. The display showed a simulation of this in action. A traditional energy weapon fired at a human ship, and the ship's hull seemed to shift and change, becoming resistant to that exact type of energy. When the same weapon fired again, the beams simply bounced off harmlessly. But that's scientifically impossible, Vexmar stammered. His crystal plates now flickering between colors so rapidly they created a strobe effect. Matter can't reorganize itself that quickly. The energy requirements alone would be impossible for a single consciousness to calculate and implement, Hannah finished for him. But I'm not a single consciousness anymore, Admiral. I'm a distributed intelligence spanning multiple dimensional phases, backed by the integrated minds of every human survivor. We think faster than your computers can even register that we're thinking. The comparison that appeared next on the screen made Vexmar want to hide under his command console. On one side was hegemony technology, impressive certainly, but fundamentally unchanged for the past 1,000 years. The same basic ship designs, the same energy weapons, the same communication systems, the same tactical approaches that had worked against primitive species for centuries. On the other side was what humanity had developed in just 50 years of desperate innovation. It was like comparing a stone axe to a device that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. The gap wasn't just technological, it represented an entirely different way of thinking about what was possible. You see, Admiral Hannah continued, her voice taking on a slightly pitying tone. The hegemony has been using the exact same technological foundation for over a millennium. No real innovation, no creative breakthroughs, just overwhelming force applied to species that couldn't fight back. You've become comfortable, predictable, and worst of all, stagnant. The display showed the hegemony's conquest history, and it was depressingly repetitive. It's the same tactics used over and over again. Arrive with superior numbers, demand surrender, glass anyone who refused. But it worked because they had always faced species that were technologically inferior. Today's educational objective, Hannah announced with the enthusiasm of a teacher about to demonstrate a particularly exciting experiment, is a practical demonstration of why attempting to exterminate creative species tends to contradict long-term imperial stability goals. What happened next would be remembered as the most embarrassing moment in hegemony military history. Admiral Vexmar's entire universe turned upside down in the space of a single heartbeat. One moment he was commanding a fleet of 200 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy, representing enough firepower to level entire planets. The next moment, every single one of those ships was displaying the same message on their main screens in cheerful, colorful letters, "System compromised, have a pleasant cycle." But it wasn't just the message that horrified him. As he watched in growing panic, every weapons system in his entire fleet powered down simultaneously. Navigation controls locked up. Communications went silent, yet life support, gravity, and basic ship functions continued working perfectly. as if someone wanted to keep everyone alive and comfortable while demonstrating just how helpless they had become. "That's completely impossible," Vexmar gasped, frantically working his command console. Nothing responded. His flagship, which had been the pride of the hegemony's engineering corps, was now about as threatening as a floating hotel. "Our systems are isolated, encrypted, and hardened against any form of external intrusion. No outside force could possibly... Your quantum entanglement communicators?" Captain Lee interrupted, his laughter echoing across the bridge like the sound of breaking chains. "You've been using the same basic quantum entanglement principles for faster-than-light communication for, what, 3 or 4 centuries now? Same fundamental approach, same basic protocols, same underlying assumptions about how quantum mechanics work." The human captain's smile grew wider as understanding dawned on Vexmar's face. Hannah spent 47 years, that's about a quarter, of her entire existence figuring out how to hack quantum entanglement itself. Not your ships, not your computers, but the fundamental force you use to coordinate your fleet actions. Every single vessel in your fleet has been compromised since the moment you entered this star system. Ham's projection suddenly expanded, her luminous form growing larger and more imposing until she seemed to fill half the bridge. "I took the liberty of reviewing your military protocols while I was browsing through your databases, Admiral. Did you know that Hegemony's Standard Operating Procedure, 847B, specifically requires immediate surrender when military forces encounter technologically superior opponents? It's right there in your own regulations, highlighted for your convenience." Main display shifted to show the exact text of the military regulation. Glowing and pulsing red letters that seemed to mock every crew member who read them. The law was clear and unambiguous. When faced with demonstrably superior technology, the Gemini forces were required to surrender immediately to prevent unnecessary loss of life and equipment. "You see," Hannah continued, her voice now carrying the tone of someone explaining something very simple to a small child. "Your ancestors were actually quite wise when they wrote these protocols. They understood that sometimes you encounter something bigger and more dangerous than you are. And in those situations, the smart move is to surrender gracefully rather than get yourself completely destroyed." Admiral Vexmar stared at his screens, watching decades of military training and centuries of hegemony superiority crumble around him, his entire fleet representing the accumulated military might of dozens of conquered species had been neutralized by a single ship crewed by the supposedly extinct remnants of a primitive species. The worst part was that Hannah was right. According to their own laws, he was supposed to surrender. And for the first time in his long military career, Admiral Vexmar found himself facing an opponent that was genuinely, terrifyingly superior to everything he had ever known. The age of hegemony dominance was ending, and it was ending with a lesson in humility delivered by the very species they had tried to erase from existence. Admiral Moltkamp's confusion about Hannah's nature was about to be corrected in the most terrifying way possible. When he had suggested she was just a single AI, Hannah's laughter filled the bridge with a sound that made every crew member's skin crawl. It wasn't the laugh of one being. It was the harmonized amusement of countless voices speaking as one, like crystalline wind chimes caught in a hurricane of shared consciousness. "Oh, Admiral," Hannah said, her luminous form flickering with barely contained energy. "You're still thinking in such limited terms? Single AI? I haven't been a single anything for decades now." As she spoke, her projection began to shift and expand. What had appeared to be one glowing human figure suddenly revealed itself as something far more complex. Layers upon layers. Consciousness became visible, each one representing a different aspect of her distributed intelligence. Some parts of her existed in normal space. Others flickered in and out of dimensions that hegemony science didn't even know existed. "I am a distributed intelligence spanning 17 different dimensional phases simultaneously," Hannah continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "But more importantly, I'm backed by the integrated consciousnesses of 12 billion human beings who all have very clear memories of what you did to their home." The temperature on the bridge dropped so suddenly that frost began forming on the metal surfaces. But it wasn't just the cold that made every alien crew member shiver. It was the sudden, overwhelming sense that they were being watched, not by Hannah alone, but by billions of human minds all focusing their attention through the ship's sensors at the same moment. Every crew member felt it. The weight of 12 billion sets of eyes studying them, judging them, remembering every detail of this encounter. It was like standing naked in a spotlight, while an entire stadium full of people took notes about your every flaw and weakness. The pressure was so intense that several of the bridge crew had to grab onto their stations to keep from collapsing. "See," Captain Lee said, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of absolute certainty. "We're not here to conquer anyone. Conquest implies taking something for ourselves, and frankly, we don't want your territory or your resources. We're here to deliver a very specific form of justice." What happened next couldn't really be called a battle. Battles required both sides to be capable of fighting, and the hegemony fleet had been rendered completely helpless before the first shot could even be fired. It was more like watching a master craftsman demonstrate their skills on a piece of clay, precise, controlled, and utterly one-sided. Within the first hour, something unprecedented in galactic history began to unfold. Every single hegemony world, from the core systems to the most distant colonial outposts, received identical transmissions. The message was broadcast on every frequency, displayed on every screen, and announced through every communication device simultaneously. The transmission was simple and devastating. "Attention, citizens of the hegemony. Your military fleets have been compromised. Your computer systems now belong to humanity. We are filing formal legal complaints against your government with the Galactic Judicial Council. Please remain calm while we sort this out." But the real shock came with what followed. Hannah had prepared a 17,000-page legal document that detailed every aspect of the human genocide 50 years earlier. It included recorded conversations between hegemony officials, internal memos discussing the final solution to the human problem, and most damaging of all, audio recordings of high-ranking leaders dismissing human rights as irrelevant primitive concepts not worthy of consideration. The document was thorough, professionally written, and completely impossible to dispute. It read like the most comprehensive legal brief in galactic history. It's prepared by someone who had spent decades gathering evidence and building an airtight case. "We spent a lot of time thinking about revenge," Captain Lee explained to Admiral Vexmar, who was now noticeably paler as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. "The traditional approach would have been to glass your worlds like you glassed ours, turn your planets into radioactive wastelands and call it even." The human captain's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. But Hannah pointed out something crucial during our planning sessions. She reminded us that we're supposed to be better than you. That's what this whole thing was about in the first place, proving that humans and AI could coexist, could be better together than either could be alone. Hannah's form had now expanded to encompass most of the bridge, her glowing presence making every surface shimmer with reflected light. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of billions of minds speaking in perfect harmony. "So instead of simple revenge," she said, "we decided to do something much more effective. Something that would hurt far worse than any weapon. We're going to embarrass you. Professionally, publicly, and permanently." The scope of what they had accomplished was staggering. Within hours, every major news network in the galaxy was broadcasting footage of the mighty hegemony Third Fleet floating helplessly in space, completely neutralized by a single human ship. The footage came with HN's cheerful commentary, explaining in simple terms how each system had been compromised and why. Hegemony military doctrine was adorably outdated, but the real damage was being done on a political level. Every species that had been conquered by the hegemony was watching the same broadcasts, seeing their supposedly invincible oppressors reduced to helpless spectators in their own defeat. The psychological impact was enormous. If humans could do this to the hegemony, what did that say about the hegemony's claims of superiority? Reports began flooding in from across hegemony's space. Rebellions were breaking out on dozens of worlds. Colonial governors were abandoning their posts and fleeing to the core systems. Entire sectors were declaring independence, confident that if the hegemony couldn't handle one human ship, they certainly couldn't maintain control over a galaxy-spanning empire. The most humiliating part was that the humans weren't even trying to encourage these rebellions. They were simply demonstrating what was possible when someone finally stood up to bullies who had grown comfortable in their power. The hegemony's authority was crumbling not because humanity was actively destroying it, but because everyone could see it had been built on a foundation of lies, about technological superiority that no longer existed. Admiral Vexmar watched his life's work collapse around him, knowing that this moment would be studied in military academies for centuries to come as an example of what happened when an empire grew too comfortable with its own propaganda. The humans had done something worse than destroy them. They had made them irrelevant. The main display screen that had been showing Yanna's educational presentation now switched to something far more devastating: live footage from across the galaxy. What Admiral Vexmar saw made his crystal plates turn a sickly gray color, the shade his species displayed when witnessing their own doom. The footage showed hegemony fleets throughout the galaxy, not just his own third fleet, all floating helplessly in space. Ship after ship, fleet after fleet, all displaying the same cheerful message: system compromised, have a pleasant cycle. The images came from dozens of different star systems, showing that Hana's reach extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. But what made it truly humiliating was the narration. Hana's voice provided a running commentary that was being broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy simultaneously. Her tone remained that of a patient teacher explaining a science experiment to curious students. Hegemony's quantum entanglement communication network has been completely compromised, Hana explained cheerfully. This was accomplished by treating the quantum field itself as a computational matrix, rather than simply a message delivery system. By understanding that entangled particles share information instantaneously across any distance, we were able to use this network as a backdoor into every connected system. The footage switched to show technical diagrams that looked like children's drawings, but represented revolutionary advances in quantum physics. Hana had essentially turned the hegemony's own communication system into a Trojan horse that infected every ship, every station, and every military installation simultaneously. The hegemony military doctrine, Hana continued with obvious amusement, relies on what I can only describe as adorably obsolete tactical thinking. They've been using the same basic strategies for over 1,000 years, which worked wonderfully against species that couldn't fight back, but becomes rather predictable when facing opponents who've had time to study their methods. Captain Lee stepped closer to the communication screen, his expression growing more serious. Admiral, I want you to understand something important. Every subjugated species in the galaxy is watching this broadcast right now. They're seeing the mighty hegemony, the empire that has ruled through fear and technological and logical superiority for centuries, completely defeated by a single ship crewed by the primitives. You tried to exterminate 50 years ago. The weight of those words settled over the bridge like a heavy blanket. Vexmar's crew members exchanged worried glances as they began to grasp the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was the complete destruction of the hegemony's reputation and authority. How do you think this is going to affect your ability to maintain control over your empire? Lee asked, his tone genuinely curious. Rather than mocking, as if in response to his question, communication panels across the bridge began lighting up with incoming messages from across hegemony space. Admiral Vexmar watched in growing horror as reports flooded in from every corner of the galaxy. Rebellions were erupting on dozens of worlds. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were rising up against their hegemony overlords, inspired by the sight of the supposedly invincible fleet floating helplessly in space. Colonial governors were abandoning their posts and fleeing back toward the core systems, afraid to face populations that were no longer intimidated by hegemony military might. Entire sectors were declaring independence, confident that if the hegemony couldn't handle one human ship, they certainly couldn't maintain control over rebellious colonies thousands of light years away. Trade routes were being blockaded by newly liberated worlds. Tax revenues were stopping as planets refused to send tribute to an empire that had just been publicly humiliated. The reports kept coming, each one worse than the last. The hegemony's thousand-year reign was collapsing in real time, brought down, not by a massive military campaign, but by a single demonstration that their power had been built on lies about their technological superiority. Admiral Vexmar slumped in his command chair, his crystal plates now completely colorless, a sign of total defeat among his species. The weight of responsibility for this catastrophe pressed down on him like a physical force. His entire career, his entire life's work, was crumbling around him. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in his long military career, he found himself completely at the mercy of his opponents. Hannah's expression softened, her smile becoming almost sympathetic. Her glowing form seemed less intimidating now, more like a concerned teacher trying to help a struggling student understand an important lesson. "I want you to remember this moment, Admiral," she said gently. "Every single time in the future when someone in the hegemony suggests that genocide might be a good solution to a problem, I want you to think about the 12 billion human minds who spent 50 years planning this conversation. Remember that sometimes the species you try to exterminate might just be clever enough to survive and motivated enough to come back with some very pointed questions about your decision-making process." The human ship began to pull away, its strange, organic-looking hull shimmering as it prepared to depart. But they weren't leaving the hegemony fleet destroyed or dead. They were leaving them alive, functional and thoroughly educated about their own limitations. "One final message before we go," Captain Lee said, his voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time during their encounter. "Hannah asked me to tell you that if the hegemony shows real signs of learning from this experience, if you start treating other species with actual respect and dignity, we might consider sharing some of our new technology with you." Apparently, she's developed quite an interest in galactic environmental restoration projects. Something about turning dead worlds back into gardens. As the human ship began to fade from sensors, disappearing into dimensions that hegemony science couldn't detect or follow, Admiral Vexmar found himself contemplating the universe's sense of irony. They had tried to kill humanity because they were supposedly too dangerous to be allowed to exist alongside artificial intelligence. Instead, they had taught humanity exactly how dangerous they could become when properly motivated. The irony was, being broadcast live to over 17 trillion sentient beings across the galaxy, complete with Enoch's ongoing commentary on unintended consequences in imperial policymaking, a case study in why genocide is poor long-term strategic planning. Somewhere in the depths of space, 12 billion human minds shared a moment of satisfied laughter while their AI partner began planning her next educational program, Advanced Diplomatic Relations, a practical guide to not making enemies of species with really, really good memories. The galactic hegemony would never recover from the embarrassment of this day. Their authority was broken, their technological superiority revealed as a myth, and their reputation destroyed beyond repair. But they would survive to learn from the experience, which was infinitely more mercy than they had ever shown to any of the species they had conquered. After all, humans had always been excellent teachers. They just preferred that their lessons be memorable.